Do you remember the first few days of the COVID-19 shutdown? It began in March of the year 2020. I don't remember anymore the precise moment when it dawned on me the magnitude of what was to come. I heard the phrase, an abundance of caution, for a couple of weeks, I think, before the announcement came down that I would be spending the better part of every day for the next 2 years sitting in my living room. I worked at Liberty High School in Bethlehem, so my work life, thus most of my time, revolved around the academic calendar. I normally worked until the end of the first week of June, so my earliest memories of the shutdown are of the months between March and June of 2020. I learned very quickly that the administrators were working hard to simultaneously protecting the health of their students while they were keeping them learning. Of course, they were concerned about the faculty and the staff also, but it was the students mainly that drove most of their decision making. We finished the year 2019 and 2020 with purely virtual classes, which protected the teachers and students, but which still required the kitchen staff to come to work in person. Some students needed the nutrition they got at school more than others and were thus doubly disadvantaged by Zoom classes. So my coworkers and I bagged and froze breakfasts and lunches for distribution. For a few weeks, because of my age, I was deemed more vulnerable to the virus, and hence I didn't have to come in. Then that guidance changed, and I worked 3 days a week from 6 to 9 in the morning. There was an attempt by the administration to keep the number of workers in one place at one time way down. We wore masks from the beginning. We distanced. We washed our hands every hour. We had always worn gloves, the rubber gloves. But as essential workers whose work couldn't be done virtually, we came into the schools and we did our jobs. What I remember most of those from those early days, aside from the trifecta of the thrill of only using one tank of gas for months on end, boredom, and the fear of dying, was the feeling of waiting, and not necessarily of dread. Especially when I went outside for my almost daily walk around my neighborhood to see spring happening, I imagined the earth quietly breathing. There was a hushed expectancy. And there was an anticipation of the days that I haven't forgotten now 4.5 years later. I'm still not sure what the waiting would turn out to be for, what the sensation of time standing still was signaling, and it has proven to be slightly disturbing to me that I can't figure it out. It has begun to seem like a puzzle that I haven't been able to solve, a thought lurking in the back of my mind, a sense of something not quite right. What was that something? What did I sense I was waiting for? All that suffering, all that uncertainty, all that disturbance. Maybe it was clearing the way for something new. What if we had been able to hold the uncertainty, to let it change us? Do you think there would be any difference in my memory of that worldwide trauma? My impression is that we've been in a hurry to get back to normal, whatever that is. I just used the word disturbance. Perhaps I should explain myself, because you may be thinking that I mean something that I don't in fact mean. From a book I've been reading called The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Lowenhaupt-Singh comes the definition of disturbance that I am using here. Disturbance is a change in environmental conditions that causes a pronounced change in an ecosystem. She goes on to say, floods and fires are forms of disturbance. Humans and other living things can cause disturbance. Disturbance can renew ecologies as well as destroy them. Disturbance opens the terrain for transformative encounters, making new landscape assemblages possible. Singh says that it is the view of disturbance that an ecologist would use, that is, a scientist or researcher whose field of study involves the relationships and interactions between organisms and their environment. In her book, Singh is drawing a comparison between the Matsutake mushrooms and the industry surrounding its peculiarities and the larger society in which that industry functions. She sees a parallel between disturbance in the matsutake mushroom environment and disturbance in other realms of human life. Now, I don't intend to talk about mushrooms. I'm not that interested in mushrooms. Thank you very much. But the parallel she sees between that species and our own opened up huge spaces in my vision, and that I want to discuss. The pandemic was absolutely a disturbance, and the terrain, including the social terrain, has been opened for transformation. But the question remains, what new landscape assemblages will we create in the opening generated by this disturbance? Does our world have the will and the courage to allow transformation to happen? Transformation is risky, is vulnerable, is uncertain, but often it is the way forward and needs to happen. This world has always been beautiful, but there were and are plenty of rough, jagged places too. It's not as if we had attained perfection. Now, my personal inclination is to view problems in society from a systems perspective and not from a personal point of view. I use the image of wind chimes. I don't know if you've heard this before, with the separate parts interacting with all other parts. When the wind blows, all the parts move, not just one part. It helps me to remind myself that whatever I perceive as a problem probably has roots and or echoes somewhere else, even if the relationship isn't immediately apparent. The relationships are supremely important nevertheless. A concept that particularly invites the systems perspective that I'm talking about is one called shalom. In Judaism, shalom is one of the underlying principles of the Torah. Her ways are pleasant, and all her ways are shalom. The Talmud explains, the entire Torah is for the sake of the ways of shalom. Maimonides comments in his Mishnah Torah, great is peace, as the whole Torah was given in order to promote peace in the world, as it is stated, her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. Author Cornelius Plantinga described the biblical concept of shalom, the webbing together of God, humans, and all creation in justice, fulfillment, and delight is what the Hebrew prophets called shalom. We call it peace, but it means far more than mere peace of mind or a ceasefire between enemies. In the Bible, shalom means universal flourishing, wholeness, and delight, a rich state of affairs in which natural needs are satisfied and natural gifts fruitfully employed, a state of affairs that implies joyful wonder as its creator and savior opens doors and welcomes the creatures in whom he delights. Shalom, in other words, is the way things ought to be. So, how do I think things ought to be? How do you think things ought to be? I wonder if part of recovering from the pandemic could be working towards more shalom, more flourishing, more natural needs met, and more natural gifts employed. I'm really interested in Plantinga's interpretation of shalom as universal flourishing. For a moment, just a moment, let's adopt universal flourishing as the goal of our society and look for signs that we're closer to universal flourishing now than we were before the shutdown. We may see a glimmer of a new way forward, something we can build on. Universal flourishing. It has never been true, not just in this country or this municipality, never, nowhere. In spite of hours and years of blood, sweat, toil, and the sacrifice of millions of people, famous and not remembered, there has always been plenty of misery along with any joy. I hesitated to say that for a long time as I was writing this sermon, but I believe that the truth must be spoken, even and maybe especially when it's hard to hear. Without speaking truthfully, there is no possibility of changing anything. Maybe what's good stays that way, but also what's bad now will stay bad. Over the past 60 or so years, there has been a steady increase in the number of poor people in this country. In Pennsylvania alone, about 30% of eligible voters are either poor or low income. Poor means they have an income of below $14,000 for an individual or $29,000 for a family of 4. Many of those low-wage workers are showing that they've had it with the poor working conditions they've been forced to endure. That they are refusing to work for low wages is an encouraging sign. I've heard this phenomenon described as the Empire Strikes Back. I think it's more like Return of the Jedi. People can only be pushed down for so long before they rebel. Maybe rebellion against an unjust system is a very healthy thing, a sign of life, of self-esteem, of courage. It looks like the tide is turning, slowly, but inevitably. One of the gifts from my having worked in food service for almost 10 years is that I've learned what I've learned from people who have no choice but to work those jobs. They are often the ones who have to choose between eating and taking medication. They are the ones most likely to become unhoused. They are the ones most likely to use hospital emergency rooms for their health care, because even with the Affordable Care Act, health insurance is out of reach for so many. Too often they have to regard dental health care as a luxury, both for themselves and their children. They are less likely to go to college, not because of lack of interest or ability, but because it's so expensive. They are the ones who can't schedule many personal events because their work hours vary from week to week. Where is universal flourishing for them? What change will make justice and equity possible for all? What transformation needs to happen for poor people to experience their society as generous? On a more upbeat note, this church has used the impetus of the shutdown to become more inclusive. All of our services are more accessible now than they have ever been in our entire history. The people who couldn't partake of religious services before the global trauma of the shutdown now can, as long as they can use Zoom. Still a barrier, but it's a lot better. It's been a struggle, and we still miss lots of details in the implementation of the Sunday service, but our progress is astounding. I don't know how many of you knew the details of planning a worship service before the shutdown, but there was significantly less coordination between service participants than there is now. It's pretty likely that the service music was decided in advance so that only hymn numbers need to be communicated to the music director each week in order that they might have sufficient practice time. They don't just do this, they practice. There was a sermon to be written, average 3,000 words or about 15 minutes. There were a few readings to be selected and occasionally written, and for some liturgists, perhaps another voice to recruit to do them. Now that we're online regularly, we have 2 to 4 additional participants in the service, most of whom were new to this work and were learning the job as they did it when we started. They're much better now. Most people who are drawn to worship service delivery don't have the technical background that might be able to help them with this learning curve. It's terribly frustrating to want to help and to not know how. If any seminary has trained people to cope with this need, it's a very new thing. Anyone who graduated before about 2022, unless they learned tech skills somewhere else, simply wasn't trained for this. That the pulpit is where it is now is the result of the advice of an audio engineer that I just happen to know and who has a little bit of experience with this congregation. She and I met in this space on Friday night about 2 years ago for her to assess the characteristics of this room. Quickly, she could tell where the optimal placement for our stuff for sound was, because that's her gig, that's what she does. Remember when we could finally meet in person, we experimented with a few different configurations of this room. Do you remember how bad the level and the quality of the sound was? We've also learned a few things along the way about microphones and their placement. We've learned about making slides for how to keep service participant for announcements and for service elements, and we learned about glare. There was a time when if you were white up here, you were completely washed out. You blended in with the background. What we haven't learned is how to make Zoom participants able to fully participate in our service. Their role is more passive than participants in the room. Usually they become mere observers. There are room configurations that we haven't figured out yet For example, arranging chairs in a circle is better for discussion, but then Zoomers would be looking at several people's back, and speaking to the microphone would be haphazard at best. Still, things are so much better than they were. These are just two of the signs of an increase in flourishing since the shutdown began. Not universal by any measure, but signs of progress, reasons for hope. It is important to look for the glimmers or signs of the good, whether outright joy or just a sign of progress. It's also important to let yourself be changed when the situation calls for it. Staying the same through an upheaval like the pandemic is very emphatically not a sign of strength. Stubbornness, arrogance, obliviousness, maybe. Certain events are so extraordinary that they simply demand self-examination and a willingness to transform and be transformed. It strikes me as oddly out of touch with reality and or the natural world to equate refusal to change with strength. Everything changes. Everything. Look at your face, the face of the person next to you, your hands. Are they the same as they were when you were 5? Quite the contrary. Allowing transformation to happen and recognizing its possibilities requires grappling with uncertainty, discomfort, fear, and possibly with loss. On the other hand, transformation can be for the better. As jazz musician Fats Waller once said in a song, "One never knows." Howard Zinn once described himself as something of an anarchist, something of a socialist, maybe a democratic socialist. He wrote extensively about the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the labor history of the United States. And he said, "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. Who will we be and what will we become in these exhilarating days of rapid change? What transformations will we midwife? You know, midwives don't cause births. They just cooperate with natural forces. They guide the pregnant body to do more easily what it already knows how to do, probably still with pain, but usually with a happy ending. I began this morning by asking the question, what if we had been able to hold the uncertainty, to let it change us? Do you think there would be any difference in my memory of that worldwide trauma? Well, yes. It looks like I've answered my own question. In at least 2 ways, we have changed significantly. The giant of the working poor has awakened. They've begun to assert their own worth, signaling that they aren't willing to be taken for granted anymore. And many organizations, this church included, have been pushed towards greater inclusion. We are living our values more nearly than ever before. The world isn't perfect. This church isn't perfect, but both are better than they were. It took a disturbance of the magnitude of the pandemic and resulting shutdown to make those changes, but it started and it still continues. In some ways, we're being dragged kicking and screaming towards shalom. Universal flourishing? Nah, just a little bit more. I am a dreamer, and I can recognize the glimmer of fulfillment of those dreams beginning. May it be so.